I'd like you to hear this lesson from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, starting at verse 34. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" "The son of David," they replied. He said to them, "How is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' If then David calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one could say a word in reply, and from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. Sometimes I'm asked a question I can't answer. If you read the four Gospels, you learn that Jesus never had that problem. He always knew the right answer. So earlier here in Matthew 22, the Sadducees thought they had Jesus cornered. But he answered from the Old Testament with such wisdom that they were put to silence. In America, the two major political parties are the Democrats and the Republicans. In Judaism, the two major parties were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Well, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together to see how they could capitalize on the Sadducees' setback. You could hear them. "Did you hear about Jesus meeting with the Sadducees? Let me tell you all about it. He really shut them up. Ha, ha, ha." The Pharisees were just as interested as the Sadducees in getting Jesus under control, that is, out of their hair. So they caucused. "We'll get him. Sadducees couldn't handle Jesus, but we'll do it." So one of their cleverest lawyers said, "I know what we'll ask him. We'll give him a trick question. Which is the greatest commandment in the law? And when he answers, we'll have him, because everyone knows that all the commandments are equal. We've got him now." But Matthew's text gives us a clue as to what was going on in the Pharisee caucus. The Greek word Matthew uses for test is used by Matthew only in connection with the Pharisees and the devil. That shouldn't surprise you. The devil is the author of dirty tricks. So, of course, it was the devil who gave the clever lawyer his idea. You didn't know the devil was into dirty tricks? Oh, yeah. Look at chapter 3 of Genesis. The serpent says, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" And Eve said, "Oh, no, that's not what the Lord said. He said, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but we must not eat from the tree that's in the center of the garden. And if you do, you'll die." And the devil said, "Oh, no, you'll not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good from evil. You know the rest of that story. The devil is a master of tricks that hurt and kill and destroy. It's the devil who says to the alcoholic, see how much fun everyone's having, not a care in the world? Or when the victim of alcohol or other drugs or substances is down on himself and everyone around her, besides being down on herself or himself, the devil comes around whispering, you look like death warmed over. And you feel even worse. If you don't do something quick, you'll have a miserable day. But you know how to fix it. One drink or one hit will take care of it. And the devil, who's always busy with his dirty tricks, says, oh, I see you're short of cash, and the rent's due today. You don't have the money to buy it. I know what you can do. You can tell the landlady when you get back that your dad been sick in the hospital all week and you went to see him and you got robbed in a parking lot. So she'll have to wait till Friday to get her money. The devil knows every one of your weaknesses and passions. And the devil knows precisely how to exploit every one of them. And when you catch on to the devil's tricks, usually about the time you hit rock bottom in some area of your life, maybe when you've lost your faith or your job or your family or your health and all your earthly possessions, not to mention your self-respect, your talents, your looks, when you have lost about everything there is to lose, the devil still has another trick. Devil's cunning. Devil says, hey man, it's not your fault. It must be God's fault or the church's fault or your family's fault or your boss's fault or your neighbor's fault. It's somebody else's fault, so it's all right for you to feel sorry for yourself. The devil just loves to see God's children wallowing in self-pity. Of course, the devil has many other tricks. There's the one the Sadducees and the Pharisees had fallen for. The Sadducees were the religious elite. The chief priests were selected from their ranks. If Judaism had had popes and bishops, then the pope and all the bishops would have been chosen from the Sadducee party. One of the ways they had hung on to their power was the Sadducees had made a pact with the Romans when they came in and took over. They would keep the religious community under control if the Romans would allow them to govern themselves. And so the Sadducees were the control party. That's why they had trouble with Jesus. They could not fit him into some neat little box and expect him to stay right where they put him. Jesus was always walking in on things which were oppressive to the creation. And he could not turn his back on seeing the little guy oppressed while the Sadducees lined their pockets. That's why Jesus drove the money changers from the temple. The Pharisees were different. Even though it was hard to be a good Pharisee unless you were well off financially, because you didn't have time to work, you were so busy keeping all the laws. The Pharisees were really not that much into either power or money. Pharisees were committed to making obedience to the law their life's work. Never mind, they were not averse to writing addenda to the law if it seemed to fit their lifestyle a little better. They had developed thousands of laws governing both moral and ceremonial matters. They ran the gamut from hand washing to menstrual cycles, from plowing fields to harvesting wheat, from Sabbath observance to feast days, from picking pockets to murder, from cursing a parent to perjury. Why, they were far more interested in self-righteousness than in righteousness. They knew that Mr. or Mrs. anybody could never remember all the rules, let alone keep them all. That was the idea. If everyone could keep the law, then it'd be no big deal if the Pharisees could do it. But most people could never begin to fulfill all the laws of the scribes and the Pharisees, so they made the self-righteous Pharisees feel really special. What made the Pharisees so antagonistic toward the righteous Jesus? Well, Jesus saw them for who they were. They were much more interested in being praised by men than in pleasing God. And here was Jesus drawing bigger crowds than they were. So the Pharisees tried to trick Jesus into saying something which would discredit him among the crowds. Teacher, they asked, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And reply, Jesus quotes the Shema, the basic creed of Judaism. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, the text with which every Jewish service began and the first text which every Jewish child commits to memory. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, said Jesus. But he didn't stop there. He said, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. What's Jesus mean? He says true religion consists in loving God. And our love for God must produce in us love for everyone else. It's when we love God that our fellow humans become lovable. To be truly Christian is to love God and to love all of the human family whom God made in the image of God. The love of God is not a feeling. Loving God and all humankind is unmotivated and unmanipulated, unconditional and unlimited. That's the way God's love is for us. What a treat. We don't have to do something or be beautiful or creative for God to love us. We don't have to manipulate God into loving us by promising God all the things we're going to do to please God. God loves us unconditionally with a love which never quits. Love is always a treat. Boy meets girl, they fall in love. What a treat. It happened in Massachusetts in 1861. A couple had just become engaged when he was drafted for service in the Civil War, so the wedding got postponed. For 3 years, the young soldier fought, mostly in Northern Virginia, and never suffered an injury. Now it's 1864. Ulysses S. Grant takes command of the Union armies, and General Grant's army meets the army commanded by General Robert E. Lee on the western edge of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, in an area they called the Wilderness. It's an area of woods and briars and tangled branches, and for 2 days, May 5th and 6th, just west of Chancellorsville, for 2 days the battle raged. The Union Army started with 115,000 men. When the battle was done, nearly 18,000 of them had died. And that young man from Massachusetts, who through these years had written regularly to his fiancée back home would write no more. Was he killed in the battle of the wilderness, do you ask? No, but he thought his girl back home would think he was as good as dead. So he had a friend write a letter to her. When she got the letter in an unfamiliar hand, she read, "There has been another terrible battle. It's very difficult for me to tell you this, but I've lost both my arms. Cannot write myself, so a friend is writing this letter for me. While you are as dear to me as ever, I feel I should release you from the obligation of our engagement." The young woman put the letter down, took the next train to Washington. At the field hospital, she found a sympathetic captain who told her where she would likely find her armless young man. Tearfully, she searched for him, and the moment she saw him, she threw her arms around him and kissed him. "I will never give you up," she said. "These hands of mine will be your hands." And that, my friends, is the kind of treat the love of God is. We may have got our lives in a royal mess, perhaps through no fault of our own, but more likely on our own. But Jesus says, "I will never give up on you. Come and follow me." And he calls to you today. Come and follow me. The altar's open for any who wish to respond to his loving, gracious invitation.